So, from derision to denial, I think we can see that there is ample evidence over 7 centuries or more which speaks against the gradual emergence of the male partner violence victim as simply a backlash against the focus on women. So, statistics. How many male victims are there? How many female victims are there? This can provide ammunition to start a world war. Yeah? It has generated aggression and vitriol and all sorts of threats in the academic community for 40 years or more. So I decided today I'm not going to venture into that territory. It can become a significant distraction which takes us away from the pressing needs of the victims themselves. We can all use statistics to prove the points that we want to prove. However, I do have a recollection of a study in Norway, I think it was nearly 40 years ago, which claimed to show a correlation between the stork population and the human birth rate. I will say I think this so-called study was done to prove the point about statistics. That study showed that as the stork population increased in the previous year, so did the birth rate. Now, I suspect there's a false attribution of cause and effect there, or at least I hope so. What I have done, though, is to show 3 examples of statistics that you may find on domestic violence. The first in Santa Barbara in California, taken from police records in 1983. So these are all cases where people have been found guilty of assaults and domestic violence related charges. In that study it showed 94% of the perpetrators were men and 6% were women. I've got a study done more recently from New Zealand in 2002, which is a community study, a population study of young adults, which shows 39% of the perpetrators were male and 61% were female. And then just to come down the middle, a recently released study by Professor Halford from Brisbane on Australian newlywed couples, which shows approximately equal rates of partner violence. So quoting statistics at 10 paces isn't really the way for us to proceed from here. I hope what this discrepancy will do is raise your curiosity about why there is such a discrepancy and what we can do about it. There's very good reasons why we do have such a range of discrepancies. Michael Johnson, respected researcher in the United States, is one of the first to shed some light on the vast discrepancy in these statistics. He identified that different studies used different sample populations. They asked very different questions of their participants and they used different language. So different studies came up with vastly different results. Up until this time, researchers and others had effectively been comparing apples and oranges, or rather, they'd been lumping apples and oranges together in the same bowl as though they were the same fruit. The following slides will look at the impact of using different populations on the results. Beginning at the big end of town, if we look at United Nations surveys, obviously they're drawn from a wide range of nations. They often include developing nations. They often include war-torn nations. When we do this, it's hard to separate out what is actually partner violence from civil violence and what are the causes. There's no way of determining the impact of the external environment on these figures. These figures also have little to do with countries like Australia, so they don't have much validity here. We also have National Crime Agency surveys. These tend to draw their figures from police records, court records, corrective services, or else records from women's shelters. These naturally focus on the more serious end of the spectrum, and they tend to distort figures for partner violence as well. Also, as women were rarely arrested for partner violence until the last 10 years or so, and even now it's still quite a minority, their violence simply didn't appear in these records. We can look at national victimisation surveys, which tend to be phone surveys that are done every few years. They generally tend to be set in the context of exploring women's violence, and they interview a number of men as well. But the framework is already set that it is about women's violence. Men aren't primed to think of their own experience of victimisation. Studies have shown if the violence is referred to as a crime, then women are less likely to report their own use of violence. Men are also generally unlikely to see it as violence unless they've actually been seriously injured by it. And that brings us to the fourth kind of study, which does give us much more reliable figures for the picture that's in the community today. So we look at family conflict surveys and community or population studies. These tend to be couched within a relationship conflict framework, though they investigate the same behaviours that the other surveys investigate. So they investigate criminal behaviours, but they position it in a different environment. In this situation, women are more likely to disclose their use of violence in this situation when it's not referred to as a criminal survey, and men are also more likely to disclose their own violence when it's seen as a relationship issue and not a crime, their own experience of violence. So what kinds of injuries do men receive? Men receive injuries resulting from being hit by all sorts of blunt instruments, by having objects thrown at them, glasses, saucepans, knives, whatever, by being struck with a vehicle, by being bitten, by the use of a natural weapon, and a knife is a very common one, by scalding, by boiling water or hot food. So all of the injuries that these can cause are the ones that men tend to suffer. That's not to say that women don't suffer these too, but we're here talking about male victims. And why do women assault their partners? Well, actually for much the same reasons as men do. For a need for control, in some cases. It may be trying to match their partner in control, or it may be to be the one in charge. Expression of negative emotions, frustrated, angry, hurt, they're jealous. It may be in self-defence, just as it may be for men, and it may be to seem tough, because they don't want to seem weak with their partner. Which women are likely to be most violent? Interestingly, the women who are likely to be most violent are those who did not report self-defence. So they are the primary aggressors in the relationship, they are the partner violence perpetrators, or for the women who are genuine victims and are lashing out with violent resistance. How is it that there is so little research on male victims? Well, as Elizabeth has alluded to, when this phenomenon surfaced in that era of civil rights in the late 60s, the initial focus was on women victims. And it's difficult to maintain a focus on women victims and men victims at the same time. And as female partner violence victim predominantly implies violent husband, then it's hard to hold the concept of a man as being a violent husband and a victimised male at the same time. Women victims were also not asked about their own use of violence. If they had been, then in some cases at least, it would have been seen that they were actually aggressors in their relationships. Erin Pizzey from the UK found this out. She was a champion of the cause of women victims of domestic violence, but over time she realised that it wasn't as simple as that. If men were not asked about their experience of victimisation, nobody's going to know about it, and they weren't asked. And because male victimisation was hidden, it didn't stimulate further research. It just remained more invisible. There have been effective public campaigns raised about the awareness of female victimisation, and this has unwittingly served to keep male victimisation hidden as well. And astoundingly, in the US, and perhaps in Canada as well, and who knows, in other countries, research into male victimisation has sometimes been actively discouraged by funding bodies. You can refer to Murray Strauss's references, he documents that very well, as I think Dr. Donald Dutton does too. There's been an understandable fear of having to share funding with women's services, or between women's and men's services. However, this doesn't help the child victims. It's an example of faulty thinking and doesn't provide a good solution. And the difficulty is, if we acknowledge male victims, we also have to acknowledge and work out how to deal with female offenders. And if we need more reasons why they're invisible, the media focus on sensational crimes by men against women stacks the odds somewhat. It sells papers and attracts internet readers. We have to deal with our stereotypes, the belief that because men are bigger and do use violence, perhaps more readily in some situations, that they will automatically want to assault women as well. And we make the assumption that women don't assault men because the men are bigger. Well, I can guarantee you from my own work that is not the case. There's a tendency to ridicule male victims of women's assaults. We have trouble coming to grips with that, facing that challenge. It's been politically incorrect to acknowledge male victims of female perpetrated violence, and that may lead to many of us being a bit worried about discussing it in public. And certainly something I've had to deal with is the fear of getting it wrong in my work. What if I make a mistake? What if he's a really convincing perpetrator? But I realised the solution to that was not ignoring the problem. It was skilling myself up, becoming more knowledgeable and more proficient and more able to work through this. The implications of ignoring male victims of female perpetrated violence. Physical and psychological impact on the men who are victimised, and my colleagues will talk more about that. There's a cost to the community. There's an impact on the children. Service providers, if they want to respond, don't know how to. The male victims themselves understandably build resentment, and they can become perpetrators if they weren't before. It makes it more difficult for women using abusive behaviour to seek help if we won't acknowledge it. Women who use violence for whatever reason are more likely to suffer significant injury in retaliation from their male partners. If for no other reason, that's a reason to address the problem. Services don't know how to respond to female offenders, and women are at risk of further violence in future relationships. So, beyond the paradigm, meeting the needs of victims of crime first requires we recognise their existence and understand their experience. For male victims, we have to move beyond the paradigm that has prevailed for 40 years and which has served to minimise or deny their existence, thus compromising our ability to respond to them. The fact that there are some people who are unwilling to accept that the assault of men by women does occur stems from our deeply held stereotypes about men and women. Don't take my word for all of this. There are male victims. There are enough of them. Men aren't only assaulted in self-defence, and they do suffer from it. And there's an extensive bibliography following this presentation if you'd like to see it.
Okay, thank you, Toni. Thank you very much, Toni. You've certainly highlighted some of the research paradigms we need to consider and the upskilling that us as professionals in our respective fields may need to consider.